The sea keeps its own graves. It keeps them long after men have forgotten the names on the pewter plates and the cross that once marked a captain's grave. On the morning of October 14th, 1723, a brigantine called the Nocturne slipped from the charts off Cape San Antonio and took with her a cargo that no ledger would ever dare record. For 2 centuries, the name fell like a bruise across taverns, shipping manifests, and the whispered prayers of fishermen. The Nocturne, the ghost ship of the Caribbean. The first testimony came from a log hidden in the estate of one Aldo Pereira, a sugar merchant of Port Royal. Dated April 3, 1791. Pereira's hand trembled as he drew a crude map and scrawled in Spanish a single line that would not leave any mapmaker comfortable. Avoid the shoal where the children sing at night. He described a night when the sea had given up a dark shape, a hull like the ribcage of a whale, and boys with mouths full of salt-water songs stepping ashore as if they had disembarked from a nightmare. Pereira paid a mason to sink a stone wall and pretended he had never written the map. The log was discovered in 1892 beneath floorboards during repairs. The workers swore a masked man in a black cape watched them and then was gone by dawn. A second account, far more official, appears in Admiralty papers from 1837. Lieutenant Marcus Hargreaves of His Majesty's Packet Service reported a vessel found adrift near Isla de la Vaca. No flag, no name, sails torn as if by teeth. On board were rows of empty bunks, a galley cold and brined with an unnameable stain. And in the captain's cabin a ledger that listed not cargo but names of missing children from the Sargasso-slimed parishes of the Lesser Antilles. Hargreaves noted one entry in particular. Cargo redistributed. New seals applied. Midnight pact kept. The Admiralty redacted the rest. The page survives as a single singed fragment held now in the antechamber of a maritime museum in Kingston. The brown letters like the bones of some forbidden prayer. The patterns do not end. In 1899, a missionary catalogued the existence of a hamlet called San Pedro del Mar, a forgotten set of houses half swallowed by mangrove and rumor where the children never played in daylight. They mended nets at dusk and walked single file to the mangrove edge, where they stared for hours at a horizon that seemed to answer them. Outsiders were kept back by men in masks. The villagers called them Los Guardianes, who insisted that those who peered too long into the water returned later with their voices gone, that the very shape of their faces had shifted. The missionary's diary ends with a single line. They sealed their mouths with sea salt. I heard their laughter afterwards, and it was not for me. What binds these accounts is not superstition, but a currency more sordid. Secrecy. Hidden operations, letters burned at sea, and a ring of men who moved from merchant houses to naval offices to the pews of cathedrals, all sharing the same sigil, a crescent pierced by an anchor. In the margins of a solicitor's estate in 1932, beneath a bundle of correspondence, a photograph appeared, a group in ceremonial robes, faces concealed by bone-white masks, kneeling before a small casket decorated in blue algae. The back bears a date, November 2, 1723, and the caption in a tidy clerical hand, Foundlings Consecrated. Keep the ledger closed. The ledger. The word recurs like a bell. List after list, ledger after ledger, always the ledger. Names, ages, towns of origin, the odd notation for export. Those who traced the papers found the same handwriting, an italic hand that shifted between English, Spanish, and a cipher no scholar has yet fully cracked. That cipher, where it is not burned or deliberately washed with sea salt, yields one faint pattern, coordinates which mark a place far from shipping lanes, a reef that stubbornly refuses to register on modern charts. Sailors call it the Hollow Reef. Locals call it by names that are never written, the Maw, the Hollowing. In 1978, during a hurricane that ripped the hammocks from the trees of San Pedro del Mar, a fishing skiff washed ashore carrying a single thing, a child's carved toy, a wooden ship with a tiny copper bell. The bell was bent outward, as if struck from within. The fisher folk put it beneath the town chapel. The priest refused to bless it and ordered it burned. The bell would not catch flame. The parish register records the incident. That night, 3 children left the chapel and walked into the surf, their hands clasped in the crooked sign of a sailor. They were not seen alive again. It would be neat to call these occurrences the work of madmen or of a desperate cult. Yet the truth skews darker and bureaucratic. In transcripts smuggled from an archive in Havana, transcripts which have been authenticated by independent historians, one finds the minutes of a meeting held in 1814. It was convened by men of standing, a colonial governor, a plantation owner, and an officer of naval logistics. The minutes speak plainly of an economy of souls and of preserving the commodity by periodic resealing. They speak of deliveries to an unnamed vessel disallowed, by law and of passage, to a northern market where bodies returned. From sea were labeled as losses at suit. The language is sanitized, and yet it betrays a trade in which children were a ledger entry and the sea a repository. As much as parchment and officialdom can be consulted, the most damning evidence has always been the ship itself, and the ship refuses to stay dead. On March 21, 2014, a trawler belonging to the sardine fleet of Santiago hauled a net that had tangled around timber far below its usual depth. When the crew hauled the mast to the surface, they expected only driftwood. Instead, they found a portion of hull, barnacled and black, stamped with a faint iron plate. Under days of desalination and the application of an ultraviolet lamp, the plate revealed the letters, Nocturne. The discovery made every front page for 3 days, and then the photographs, dark and wet and impossible to read, vanished from the internet as suddenly as they had appeared. The investigators who arrived from the capital were not content with municipal authority. They were men in plain black suits who wore masks inside their cars and spoke to the captain only in clipped sentences. The plate, they said, had been contaminated by marine growth and required special handling. They took the piece to a facility and barred the doors. Several months later, a diver named Ana Luisa Cruz vanished from the research vessel that had been cataloging the hull fragments. The official report said she had slipped beneath a swell. Local divers swear that at dusk they heard a bell, small and thin, sounding from where the horizon ought to be empty. 2 days later, the Navy discovered a dinghy with a child's shoe tied to its oar. A single strand of rope bore a knot the sailors called a fisher's echo, a knot used by no modern fleet but detailed in a 1722 mariner's manual. The divers refused to descend again. There is an unspoken thing about such investigations. The sea gives what it pleases, and it takes back its witnesses. Those who ask too loudly about ledgers and masks find their own pasts rearranged. A genealogist who traced the name of a Nocturne crewman in 2009 found the next week that his own great-grandmother had been registered in parish records as missing at sea, though she had lived and had children. Records will sometimes fold like paper boats and sink, and yet there remain faces who will not let the matter die. In the mangroves outside San Pedro del Mar, an old woman named Catalina keeps a watch by the water. Her hands are webbed from decades of wading, and her knuckles are carved with a string of shallow scars she calls fishing marks. Children still come to her at night with their palms pressed to her knees, asking for tales. Catalina's tale is not the sort of thing one places in a museum case. She speaks of a bell that tolls beneath the ship's keel, of a lullaby in an unknown tongue, and of a captain who wore a mask made of mother-of-pearl and could unmake the faces of men who refused him. She speaks of the ledger's last page, which, she claims, is not inked but sewn into the lining of an old chest, now used as a table in a governor's residence in Spanish Town. When asked how she knows such things, she smiles sadly and shows a small coin stamped with a crescent and an anchor, the very sigil seen on the photographs of masked men. She says simply, "They still pay in old coin." The last time the sea gave up a Nocturne piece in full, a length of keel with an iron nail driven through as if to mark a seam, it was found entangled within a centuries-old reef, close enough to shore that the tide left it exposed. At a low that happens twice a year and is called locally the hollowing tide, The fishers who found it carried the keel to shore and hammered a bell into it as an offering to whatever god claims the place. They bound the bell with rope and placed it in the chapel, and for 3 nights the wind carried music that was not wind. The priest took the bell and wrapped it in cloth and swore on holy water to bury it at sea. He went out before dawn and never returned. There are threads that lead to the heart of the matter, and there are doors that one is better to leave bolted. The ledger, the masks, the ledger's currency of children, the bell. These are the threads. If one follows them, one will pass through. The offices of men with names respectable enough to sit on councils, into cathedrals where brass and velvet hide a more precise accounting, and down into mangroves where children still sing when the tide is wrong. The truth is not a tale that ends with a press conference or a court. It is something that arranges itself in the dark, threaded into the commerce of men who found ways to supply their appetites behind sails and arches of law. There was one final entry on an undated piece of parchment found sewn into a captain's coat recovered in 2014. The ink had bled with seawater, and the letters were blotted, but the closing sentence remained unmistakable and cold. Keep the ledger sealed. The sea remembers payment, and it comes once in every generation to collect. The wind over the harbor has a way of lowering its voice at night. In San Pedro del Mar, the children still keep their distance from the water until dusk, and the men with masks, whether by blood or by oath, keep their silence like a vow. The photographs of the hull fragment that once bore the Nocturne's name are now only in private albums, shown quietly beneath lamps to those who will never speak of them again. If you listen at the hollowing tide, when the water draws its breath and the reef points its teeth to the sky, you might hear a bell, faint and corroded, answering a song that a century's ledger knows how to hum. You might think the sound is an echo of some old wrong. You might think, as many have before, that if the sea has debts, it will pay them from its own stores. You might be very wrong. For tonight, when the tide falls away and the reef shows its bones, a child in San Pedro turns her face to the pale horizon and hums the melody she learned from the men who taught her to be silent, and the bell at the chapel, buried beneath blankets of cloth, rings once more as if in answer. There is a name on the ledger yet unsigned, a line provisioned for a single mark. The bell rings. It is your turn.